Morning, Borodar. That's the limit of my Welsh, I'm afraid. Interesting to hear both Roy and Arvon talking about the importance of records going in. I've run a national recording scheme and tried to get records, and it's surprising the places you find them. Please do put records in. In terms of centipedes, well, I've been looking at them for a long time, but I've discovered there is actually a guy somewhere in North Wales called Richard Gallon, who's quite good on it. So don't feel that you should be inhibited by not having local expertise, and at the same time be aware that we as a group can offer you help with identification. It's not always that easy from photographic stuff then, though. How do you recognize a centipede? Well, hopefully you won't see one of these too often in North Wales. This is usually found in the south of France, but this particular specimen was actually found near Plymouth in a few weeks ago in a garden centre. If you do find one, be careful. They do give you a very nasty bite, but there's a centipede. And if you start to look at what they have that allow you to recognize them, next slide, they've got a segmented body, they've got a head rather like an insect, although they don't, most of them have compound eyes. Then they have a trunk with a number of segments, of which the first pair have got a pair of poison claws, which can give you a bit of a nip if you get them between your fingers. Series of leg-bearing segments. They never have 100 legs. They might have 102, but they don't have 100. It's always an odd number of pairs. And at the back is the genital things, and unlike insects, reproductive structures in centipedes are not that useful in many cases. Next slide. 4 different forms. These are the only 4 types of centipede you see in Britain and in Northern Europe, and indeed everywhere outside Australasia. There are the earth centipedes, the long ones, sometimes called wireworms. There are the ones below them, the stone centipedes, the Lithobius. Scolopendromorphs are big ones usually, and they have 21 pairs of legs. And then there are house centipedes with 15 pairs of legs, and we'll come back to them. LBS stands for leg-bearing segments. Next slide. How many are there? Well, for the total for Britain and Ireland, depending on how you count and which ones you do count as having been genuinely recorded reliably, about just over 50. For Wales, just under 40. And for North Wales, slightly under 30, with the sort of relative numbers for the various different North Wales vice counties. I stress these are the old Watsonian vice counties, not current present day administrative areas. To understand something about them, you need to know a little bit about their biology. They can be as big as 70 millimeters long, 7 centimeters. They are carnivores. They will eat nearly anything. It's said that if you put 2 centipedes into a jar and you don't take steps to separate them, by the time you get them back to your house or wherever they are, the lab, one of them will have disappeared, eaten by the other. They are fairly generalists. They will eat everything. The tropical ones will even eat birds and lizards and things. They occur in Britain in all sorts of places, from the coast to the mountains. Extremely common. You probably, in normal circumstances, could not walk more than a few yards in the countryside or even in the town without finding one. They have various degrees of tolerance of human activity, so they're often found in what we call synanthropic sites, that is urban and man-influenced sites. So it is actually possible to do quite a lot of recording of them without going out into nature reserves or into the countryside. In fact, there are probably more species in towns than there are in the countryside. They are, however, sensitive to water, either to drying out or becoming waterlogged. They tend to hide away from the sun, so mostly active at night. And of course, they do the same thing because of vulnerability to predators. Where do you find them? Well, there's a list of places, practically everywhere. The three pictures show some of the sort of sites you might find them, up to, in the case of North Wales, 1,000 metres. Now, these are general points about recording almost everything, but it applies to these as much as to anything else. It's said that if you have records from a site which was recorded 20 years ago, if you go back to it, on average, you will find about 50% of the things that were there last time, because it takes time to find them all. The distribution patterns emerge from the records. The records are made by recorders. This is all part of the system we're all involved in. There may be changes over a period of years. Some places are easier to sample than others, so they don't get sampled. It's quite difficult to sample centipedes on sand dunes. And on rocky scree, it's hard work to try and catch anything, because these things generally do run. Recording of any particular species, any particular site, at any particular time depends on all sorts of things. And of course, rarer species are less likely to be found than commoner ones. Looking at the sort of distribution, some species occur more or less throughout Britain. I'm going to show some pictures and maps of some of these. Some have apparently east-west differences. Some seem to be quite restricted. For some, there appears to be no obvious distribution. There may be historical factors, climatic factors, interspecific competition, human activity, and accidental introduction can all contribute to what you actually see. And it rather, as we said, depends on when and you look for them. Where do they come from? Well, it is possible, and I'm going to raise this issue, that some of our species might be pre-glacial survivors from refugia. But mostly one must assume that they came from the south following, and from the east, following climatic changes, and this took place. These will be moving up with the vegetation until the breakthrough of the North Sea and the English Channel, which was about the end of the Ice Age, probably 12,500 years ago was the end of the Ice Age, less than 10,000 years ago, the break. Species arrive naturally sometimes, maybe by rafting on vegetation. Species are brought in accidentally by human activity with food materials. We refer to these very often as non-natives or introduced. They're all modified by the competition, the tolerance they have, habitat change, and anything that we as humans do. Moving on to the idea of introduction, this is a fairly big beast, which has thought to be introduced from southern Europe. It occurs over most of northern Europe, and it seems to have all come from a similar site, from barcoding work with DNA. These are probably transported by natural processes, but they kind of come in with human activity. Others have definitely come in with human activity. One of the criteria for assigning a species to introduced or non-native is its occurrence in artificial environments. And if we look at this particular animal, which is mapped here, this is a provisional map from the National Recording Scheme, and the dots represent records that have been made, 10 km. About 170 records of it, of which 70% weighted to take account of the ratio of collected from urban as to rural sites, are from urban sites. There is in fact a single record from North Wales. It's one that might well turn up in North Wales again, in other sites, in human influence areas, in towns. I've never collected in the middle of Bangor. I've no idea what you might find if you look there. Now this particular animal is a good example of synanthropy. It lives in proximity to and benefits from human activity. Now, if you're a non-specialist, there's an awful lot of things to be gained by these sort of sites. Food, shelter, warmth, maybe a reduction in predators, soil changes, maybe dispersal possibilities with spreading out, again by human activity. But there are other risks of it being temporary, the lack of normal prey, new competitors and so on, which raises an interesting issue of conservation. If you find a new species in a synanthropic site, how do you conserve it, or is it possible to do so? There's a whole spectrum of species. Some are what we call avoiders, some are what we call urban dwellers, maybe slightly different in different areas. And interestingly, they can survive further north than they would naturally, due to the absorption of heat by buildings and its radiation at night. There's also a feature which is helpful if you're a centipede expecting to spread, and this is parthenogenesis. It's not very widespread, but it does occur, and I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of them. Moving on, this is a little thing called Shendyla dentata, which was first found in Surrey in 1968 in soil, and it was actually extracted from soil using a soil extraction funnel. It's been subsequently found by hand searching. It probably is fairly widespread in the south of England, and it might occur in Wales because it's certainly been found in Shropshire. So I would guess it's around in Wales, but it's small, it's fairly seasonal, and it's difficult to find often. We don't know where it came from originally. This was the first record in Europe since the 1920s, basically. It's now known from other parts in Northern Europe. And then moving on to another one, Lamictes. This is in fact an import from Australasia. We don't know how it got here, but as you can see from that map, it's pretty widespread. It's an interesting animal, and we'll come back to it. And it's clearly pretty well spread. But think about it as a parthenogenic animal. You only need one female, and you can get a new colony. Now, rather than go through a lot of different Welsh centipedes, showing you pictures of everything and boring you with PowerPoint, I'll just look at a few species and a few habitats. This is a very common big yellow centipede. There are a number of yellowish centipedes. It's got and it's around about 80 leg pairs. About 50% of weighted records are actually urban, relatively rare rural. It's quite common in rural areas in Cornwall. It's recorded all over North Wales, as you can see, but a big white gap in what is obviously Snowdonia, because it does seem to be a thing that favours human influence site. And you'll see it's not very common in Scotland. It does occur up certainly to Aberdeen. Big, yellow, and there are other features. These are two small ones. They look very similar. They're both only about 2 centimeters long at most, and they both only got 39 leg pairs or thereabouts. Ecologically, they're different. Here's looking at the split screen with the two of them, Shendyla nemorensis, about equal numbers from urban, suburban, village and rural. GEOPHILUS truncorum. These things do have English names, but I'm afraid they're made up ones, so they're probably not much more useful than the Latin ones. This is almost all from rural sites, or what we term suburban sites. You'll see it occurs all over Britain, right up to the Shetland Islands, and Shendyla, on the other hand, is relatively uncommon in Scotland. If you go further south into France, Geophilus truncorum disappears, and Shendyla is a common small one. Moving on from these two, centipedes occur in buildings. This is obviously a concern if you've never met a centipede in a building. You suddenly see one running across the carpet or up the wall. And these are just chance ones which probably can just about survive for a while indoors. We see that there's some that can probably survive better. Remember that indoors there's probably plenty of insect life as food. There's also, they turn up in unheated greenhouses. There's a little one here. This is Lithobius melanops. It's got a dark stripe along the back, and it occurs in unheated greenhouses quite commonly. You see it's actually quite a common animal across the whole of Britain, including Wales, but it actually seems to be, from the maps, more widely distributed in South Wales. Centipedes in heated greenhouses, glasshouses, these are interesting ones. From a conservation point of view, they're probably not important, but they're of interest. Animals could be introduced with soil or compost. Some species are only known from such locations. This is a little one that's found in the National Botanic Garden of Wales and a few other localities like the Eden Project in Cornwall. And this is one that turned up at Bangor in a heated greenhouse and is scattered around in Britain in heated greenhouses, but curiously it turns up on the coast outdoors in southeast England. There are lots of unanswered questions that, you know, much more information will be helpful for. Centipedes also occur on the seashore. There's about 4 species in Britain that occur on the seashore, and if you look at this one, which looks a little bit like a red worm, and that is quite confusing at first, it's all around the British coast. You can see it all the way around here and all around the Irish coast. And there are other species. Strigamia maritima is so easy to find in large numbers, except when you want large numbers, that it's been used for all sorts of population studies and genetic studies and development studies. Centipedes occur in the mountains. Richard has collected in Snowdonia and found 3 species at around 1,000 meters. These do also occur elsewhere. These are the 3, of which Lithobius curtipes is the most interesting. It's got a very scattered distribution in England, 2 records in Wales, quite a number of records in Scotland, quite a number of records in Wales, and quite a number of these are upland ones. It's got a very curious distribution, which we can look at. Here it is in Britain. Here are the Welsh records, and you'll see it occurs as far as Scottish borders. Compare it with another one, which is very similar in appearance, Crassipes, which occurs almost everywhere except in the southwest. Then look at the maps for the Nordic countries, and Curtipes occurs right up to northern Norway, and Crassipes disappears quite quickly. Now, I just wonder if what we've got with Curtipes is a glacial relic that survived, because we know it can tolerate places that are very cold, very exposed, and with very limited summertime. It might have survived in Britain, perhaps in Wales, and then subsequently spread out to other parts of the country. It's the one I would flag up as maybe that is a glacial relic. I'm going to take you through fairly quickly a number of other centipedes. This is Strigamia. These are reddish brown ones. This is red brown species of Geophilus. These are 2 reddish brown things. Reddish brown ones tend to be more tolerant of superficial sites, and there's a number of yellowish ones. You will see they're not exactly distributed the same way, but they're both very, very widespread. And then we have these cryptops. We've met one before. And this is the one we were looking at, 50 millimeters. It's a big beast, probably our biggest sort of running centipede. And you can see that Cryptops tends to be southern. Then there are the big brown jobs, big Lithobius. This is forficatus, Lithobius forficatus, by far the commonest, very common everywhere. And this is the sort of things you look at for identification, the projections on those back plates, the tergites. Very common, especially in human influence sites. It's the one you'll probably find in your garden. You might turn this one up. It's turned up in North Wales. It's got slightly longer legs, and there are one or two other characters that distinguish it. It's another big brown one. It gets even bigger. And this is one which everyone should be able to record. If you look, you'll see it's got striped legs. It's variegated. It's Lithobius variegatus. Curious distribution, doesn't seem to like the east of England, doesn't seem to like most of Scotland, but it's incredibly widespread in the south and west and in Ireland. And this is one of those that Richard found at 1,000 meters. And then we have some small ones. Small brown jobs are, as I think the bird watchers called it, the LBJs. There are a number of these, and they're not that straightforward to identify sometimes, but you know, they're worth looking at, and they're interesting, and they have different distribution patterns. And that's just a list of them. And then this finally, have you ever seen this thing? This is a house centipede. It's got very long legs. It runs very fast. In the Channel Islands, can turn up in your bath apparently. It's quite common in the Channel Islands. It's being found more and more in Britain. In mainland Britain between 1881 and 1990, there were a total of 8 records. Between 1991 and 2020, there were 30. It's almost always indoors, in offices, being found in a hospital dispensary, houses, storerooms, factories. It's been found in Liverpool, one of which was an outdoor sighting. It might well be seen in North Wales, and it's been recorded in Newport Docks in the south. So that's one to look out for. If you see it running up your wall, which is how somebody in Blackpool described it. They were sitting watching television one night and they saw this thing run up the wall. You can't mistake it for much else. It's go faster stripes. That is a quick run through. I'm sorry, a bit rushed maybe. Hopefully you might start to look at these things, and hopefully you might even start trying to record them. And going back to that one, the Lithobius variegatus, that is the one that everybody can record because it's so obvious. And just thank you. There is a short article that Richard and I wrote last year, which is in the bulletin of the Myriapod Isopod group, which, if you want to read, is online for free at www.bmig.org.uk. There are keys. There's an aid gap key and a more expensive Linnaean Society synopsis. We're trying to produce an atlas at the moment. It's in the press. I have to acknowledge everyone who, over the years, has collected centipedes in Wales, including Snowdonia, and of course Cofnod, and their role in recording them. So, thank you very much, Doc.